Fellow travelers of Middle-earth, have you ever wondered why the most powerful elven army in the Third Age was left out of the most important military council in history? Picture this. Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, Círdan, and Radagast sitting in solemn council, discussing how to confront the growing shadow in Dol Guldur. While only a few hundred miles away, Thranduil commands thousands of seasoned warriors who have been fighting that very darkness for centuries. It does not make sense, does it? Today we shall dive deep into the archives of Tolkien's letters, the appendices, and those crucial details hidden in the margins of the Silmarillion to uncover why the Elven King was deliberately kept away from the White Council. This is not merely about politics. It is about pride, ancient grudges, and decisions that shaped the entire War of the Ring. Let us uncover the 10 solemn reasons that explain this grave omission in Middle-earth's defense. When we speak of Thranduil's exclusion from the White Council, we must return to the moment that forever defined his family's reputation, the last alliance of elves and men. Something happened at Dagorlad that few now speak of, yet all remember. Oropher, Thranduil's father, made a decision that would haunt the woodland realm for thousands of years. The old king was not content to follow Gil-galad's battle plans. He wished to prove that the Sylvan elves could fight as fiercely as their Noldoran cousins. Picture the scene. Gil-galad had carefully positioned his forces, with precise timing for a coordinated assault upon Sauron's armies. The High King of the Noldor had faced the Dark Lord before. He knew his tactics and understood the vital importance of discipline in battle. But Oropher was proud, stubborn, and weary of taking orders from one he saw as merely another Noldoran exile. The woodland realm had stood independent for over 1,000 years. Why should they now bow to Gil-galad's authority? What happened next was catastrophic. Oropher charged ahead of the main host, taking 2/3 of his army with him into premature battle. The Sylvan elves fought like lions, yet they were utterly out of step with the overall strategy. Instead of a coordinated pincer movement, they sowed chaos across the battlefield. Gil-galad was forced to abandon his carefully laid plans to support Oropher's reckless advance, shattering the entire formation of the alliance. The casualties were staggering. Oropher himself fell in that ill-timed charge, along with the greater part of his host. Thranduil, then little more than a prince, suddenly found himself king of a decimated realm. The survivors limped back to Mirkwood with perhaps only 1/3 of the force they had brought to war. More importantly, they carried back the shame of a battle plan ruined by their king's pride, and the bitter knowledge that their disobedience had cost other realms dearly. Elrond was there. He saw everything. The future Lord of Rivendell witnessed how Oropher's disobedience turned what should have been a decisive victory into a bloody and costly struggle. When Gil-galad later fell, in part because his forces had been weakened by supporting Oropher's disaster, Elrond inherited not only leadership, but also the memory of how the pride of the woodland realm had nearly cost them the war. Fast forward to the Third Age. Elrond is one of the founding members of the White Council. When they discuss whom to include in their secret order, do you truly believe he would recommend the son of the elf who had nearly sabotaged the last alliance? The White Council required absolute coordination, perfect timing, and complete trust among its members. They could not afford another Dagorlad. This was not merely about holding grudges. It was about practical military necessity. The White Council operated on the principle that every member would follow agreed strategies without question. They needed to know that when Gandalf said wait, all would wait. When Galadriel proposed a course, it would be followed with precision. The bloodline that had given them Oropher's catastrophic independence could not be trusted with that level of coordination. Thranduil might have been a very different leader from his father, yet the other council members could not take the risk. They had seen with their own eyes what happened when the woodland realm chose to go its own way at a crucial moment. Better a smaller, more reliable council than a larger one that might fracture when it mattered most. The ghosts of Dagorlad haunted every discussion about including Thranduil, and in the end, those ghosts prevailed. Here is something most readers miss when they consider Thranduil. He was not merely another elven lord ruling over a mixed population. Unlike Elrond in Rivendell or Galadriel in Lothlorien, who welcomed refugees and exiles from all elven kindreds, Thranduil actively favored his Sylvan subjects over any Noldor or Sindar who might seek sanctuary in his realm. This was no accident. It was deliberate policy that ran directly counter to everything the White Council stood for. Think of what the other council members had built. Rivendell was a refuge for the weary and oppressed, where Noldoran law mingled freely with Sindarin wisdom, and even men were welcome. Lothlorien, though more selective, still upheld the ancient alliances between different elven peoples. Even Círdan's Grey Haven served elves of all kindreds preparing for the journey west. They were all building bridges, forging unity. But in the woodland realm, Thranduil's court spoke Sindarin because it was his native tongue. Yet the administration, the military leadership, and the cultural priorities all favored the indigenous Sylvan population. When Legolas describes his people to the Fellowship, he does not speak of grand libraries or preserved Noldoran artifacts. He speaks of trees, of hunting, and of woodland skills passed down through Sylvan tradition for millennia. This was not necessarily wrong, yet it created a profound philosophical divide. The White Council sought to preserve all the free peoples of Middle-earth, which required maintaining connections between different cultures and races. They needed leaders who could look beyond their own people's immediate interests. Thranduil's Sylvan-first policies suggested he might place the specific needs of his realm above broader strategic concerns. Look at how this played out in practice. When the Dunedain needed to track Gollum through Mirkwood, they had to negotiate with Thranduil as if he were a foreign power. When refugees from other elven communities sought shelter during various crises, the Woodland Realm's response was notably cooler than what they received in Rivendell. Thranduil was not hostile to outsiders, yet he was not eager to welcome them either. The White Council members would have seen this as a serious liability. What if they needed to coordinate refugee movements during a major crisis? What if Noldoran lore proved crucial to understanding one of Sauron's strategies? Could they count on Thranduil to set aside his Sylvan preferences for the greater good? His track record suggested the answer was no. There was also a deeper philosophical issue. The other council members saw themselves as guardians of all Middle-earth's wisdom and peoples. Thranduil saw himself first and foremost as king of the Woodland Realm. That is not a criticism. Every leader must prioritize his own people, but it made him fundamentally incompatible with the White Council's mission. When the moment of decision came, would Thranduil sacrifice Sylvan lives to save Gondorian cities? Would he share woodland military secrets to aid Rohan? Would he accept Noldoran battle strategies that went against Sylvan tradition? The other council members could not be certain, and uncertainty was a luxury they could not afford when facing the Dark Lord. The cruel irony of Thranduil's situation was that living next door to Sauron made him simultaneously the most valuable potential ally and the most dangerous security risk. Dol Guldur sat in the very heart of Mirkwood, casting its shadow over the Woodland Realm for nearly 1,000 years before the White Council was even formed. Thranduil's people had been fighting that corruption longer than any other, developing tactics and defenses that no other realm possessed. Yet that same proximity made him the last person the Council could safely trust with their deepest secrets. Consider the geography. The Woodland Realm's borders literally wrapped around Dol Guldur's sphere of influence. Thranduil's patrols came within miles of the necromancer's stronghold on a regular basis. His people could smell the corruption in the air, feel the wrongness in the forest that surrounded them. They knew the enemy's daily movements, understood how the shadow moved through the trees, and had developed countermeasures for threats that other realms had never encountered. But that knowledge came at a price. Living for centuries under Sauron's influence had to leave marks, and not all of them visible. The White Council members would have wondered, what if some of Thranduil's people had been compromised? What if the necromancer had spies in the Woodland Realm's court? What if Thranduil himself had been subtly influenced without realizing it? These were not paranoid fantasies. They were legitimate security concerns. Look at what happened to the forest itself. Mirkwood was no longer called Greenwood the Great because the shadow had physically transformed it. Rivers ran black, paths led nowhere, and strange creatures emerged from the darkness. If Sauron could corrupt trees and streams, what might he do to minds that lived among them every day? The Council could not risk their plans being known to someone who spent every day breathing air poisoned by the Dark Lord's presence. There was also the question of divided loyalties. Thranduil's primary responsibility was protecting his people from an immediate threat that surrounded them every day. Could he truly be objective about White Council strategies when his own realm's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance with the power next door? Sometimes the best strategy for the Woodland Realm might directly conflict with the Council's broader goals. The Council needed someone who could think strategically about the entire war, not merely their local theater. Thranduil's perspective was invaluable for understanding Dol Guldur, yet it was also limited by his day-to-day reality. When you are focused on keeping your people alive against an immediate threat, you cannot always see the bigger picture. The council needed members who could sacrifice short-term local advantages for long-term global strategy. Even more concerning was the possibility of intelligence leaks, not because Thranduil would deliberately betray the council, but because the necromancer had had centuries to develop ways of extracting information from the woodland realm. Mind-reading, torture of captured scouts, corruption of messengers. Sauron possessed many tools for gathering intelligence. Including Thranduil in sensitive discussions might have been like holding their meetings in Dol Guldur itself. The final consideration was, what would happen if Thranduil were forced to choose between saving his people and supporting the council's plans? If Sauron threatened to destroy the woodland realm unless Thranduil revealed the council's secrets, what would he do? Any good king would choose his people over abstract strategic goals. The council could not put him in that position, and they could not trust that he would not face exactly that choice. Here is something that becomes crystal clear when one maps the membership of the White Council. Every single member either bore a ring of power or had direct access to one. This was no coincidence. It was the fundamental requirement for membership that few speak of openly. Gandalf bore Narya, though he kept it secret. Galadriel wielded Nenya openly in Lothlorien. Elrond commanded Vilya from Rivendell. Even Círdan, who had given Narya to Gandalf, had centuries of experience with ring lore and maintained connections to all three elven rings. The rings of power were not mere jewelry. They were tools of resistance against Sauron's will. Tolkien makes this clear in his letters. The three were made to preserve and protect, to maintain havens of peace and wisdom against the growing darkness. The rings of power were not merely tools of vision or preservation. They granted their bearers a level of mental protection against Sauron's influence that ordinary magic could not provide. When the council met to discuss strategies against the Dark Lord, they needed absolute certainty that their deliberations could not be penetrated by his mind-reading arts. Thranduil possessed no such protection. He was undeniably powerful, skilled in the old ways, and wise in woodland lore. But when it came to defending his thoughts against Sauron's probing, he was as vulnerable as any other elf. The council could not risk their most sensitive discussions being overheard telepathically because one member lacked the mental shields that the rings provided. Think of what the council was actually doing. They were not merely planning military campaigns. They were discussing Sauron's psychology, his likely strategies, his fears and weaknesses. They were sharing intelligence about the Nazgul, debating the significance of various signs and portents, and making decisions about when and how to reveal their knowledge of the One Ring's survival. These conversations required absolute mental privacy. The protection went both ways. The rings did not only shield their bearers from Sauron's intrusion, they also prevented Sauron from using the ring-bearers as unwitting spies. A person without such protection might have their dreams infiltrated, their thoughts subtly influenced, their memories plucked without them ever knowing. Including Thranduil would have created a security breach that could compromise everything. There was also the question of power dynamics within the council. The ring-bearers could communicate with one another in ways that did not involve speech, subtle influences, shared perceptions, an understanding that went beyond normal elven telepathy. Thranduil would have been excluded from these deeper levels of communion, always slightly outside the inner circle, even when he was physically present. Consider what happened when Gandalf finally revealed his ring to the other council members. The immediate recognition, the understanding of why certain decisions had been made, the realization of how the rings had been working together all along. These moments of revelation required ring lore that Thranduil simply did not possess. He could not fully participate in conversations about ringcraft, nor could he understand the subtle implications of various ring-related strategies. Most cruelly, the Council's ultimate plan depended heavily upon ring lore. The decision to attack Dol Guldur was precisely timed to coincide with other ring-related events. The strategy of revealing Gandalf's true nature to Saruman was calculated based on ring power dynamics. The choice to support the Ring-Bearer's mission required an understanding of how all the Rings of Power would interact during the final crisis. Thranduil could not contribute meaningfully to these discussions because he lacked the fundamental qualification that made such conversations possible. The Siege of Erebor after Smaug's death revealed something about Thranduil's character that horrified the other elven leaders and permanently damaged his reputation among the wise. While refugees fled the burning ruins of Lake Town and Dane's dwarves marched to reclaim their ancestral home, Thranduil appeared with an army demanding payment for ancient debts. This was not merely poor timing. It was a fundamental betrayal of the very values the White Council was founded to protect. Picture the scene from the perspective of the other leaders. Bilbo had just helped destroy one of Middle-earth's greatest threats, opening the way for the Lonely Mountain to be reclaimed. The people of Lake Town had suffered devastating losses in helping to slay the dragon. Dane's dwarves were finally returning to their ancestral halls after decades of exile. This should have been a moment of celebration, of cooperation, of rebuilding after a great victory against darkness. Instead, Thranduil arrived with armed forces and immediately began making demands about compensation for losses his father had suffered decades earlier, while people were still dying from exposure and dragonfire. He was calculating the value of lost treasures, while Dane was trying to establish basic security for his people. Thranduil was threatening war over ancient grudges. The optics were terrible, but the real problem was what this revealed about Thranduil's priorities. The White Council existed to coordinate resistance against darkness and to put aside petty concerns for the greater good. Here was Thranduil doing exactly the opposite, prioritizing material wealth over humanitarian needs, choosing old grievances over present cooperation, threatening violence in the aftermath of a great victory against evil. The other council members would have asked themselves, if Thranduil could behave this way after Smaug's death, how would he act during other crises? Would he demand payment before helping defend Gondor? Would he refuse to aid Rohan unless they offered territorial concessions? Would he abandon joint operations if he did not receive a large enough share of any recovered treasures? Elrond, who had spent centuries building Rivendell as a refuge for all who needed sanctuary, must have been particularly appalled. Here were refugees from Lake Town desperately needing aid, and Thranduil was more concerned with recovering jewels his grandfather had once commissioned. Galadriel, who had rejected far greater treasures than anything in Erebor's hoard, would have seen this as clear evidence of spiritual corruption. The timing made it even worse. This happened just as the White Council was becoming more active, just as they were realizing that the growing threat from Dol Guldur required closer cooperation. They needed members who could think beyond their own immediate interests, who could sacrifice local gains for strategic advantages. Thranduil's behavior at Erebor proved he could not be trusted to make those kinds of decisions. There was also the military angle. The council needed leaders who could make quick decisions based on changing circumstances, who could adapt their plans when new information emerged. Thranduil's rigid insistence on collecting debts, even when the strategic situation had completely changed, showed a dangerous inflexibility. What if the council needed to abandon carefully laid plans because of new intelligence about Sauron? Would Thranduil adapt, or would he insist on sticking to original agreements regardless of changed circumstances? The aftermath of the siege made things even worse. When the Battle of Five Armies erupted, Thranduil found himself fighting alongside the very people he had been threatening hours earlier. His transition from potential enemy to battlefield ally happened so quickly it gave everyone whiplash. The other elven leaders would have wondered, how can we trust someone whose loyalties shift so dramatically based on immediate circumstances? The White Council needed rock-solid reliability, not fair-weather friendship that changed with the wind. When military historians study the Third Age, they often overlook a crucial detail about Thranduil's army. It was massive, but completely wrong for the kind of war the White Council was planning. The Woodland Realm's forces were specialists, incredible at forest warfare, unmatched in their home terrain, devastating when fighting on their own terms. But the Council was not planning to fight Sauron in the woods of Mirkwood. They were preparing for coordinated strikes, siege warfare, and pitched battles in open terrain, where the Sylvan Elves' advantages would become dangerous liabilities. Look at how Thranduil's military was organized. His soldiers were scouts, hunters, and guerrilla fighters who had spent centuries perfecting hit-and-run tactics against orcs and spiders in the dense forest. They could appear out of nowhere, strike hard, and melt back into the trees before the enemy could react. They knew every path through Mirkwood, could move silently through undergrowth that would trip any other army, and could live off the land for months without supply lines. But when the White Council finally moved against Dol Guldur, what did they need? They needed forces that could storm a fortress, hold defensive positions, coordinate complex multi-front assaults. They needed siege engines, heavy cavalry, and disciplined formations that could maintain cohesion during massive battles. Thranduil's woodland specialists would have been as out of place in that kind of warfare as heavy cavalry would be in the depths of Mirkwood. The council members understood this limitation. Elrond had commanded mixed forces during the last alliance. He knew the difference between forest skirmishers and battlefield troops. Galadriel's strategic mind could see that adding Thranduil's army to their assault on Dol Guldur would actually complicate their plans rather than strengthen them. How do you coordinate a siege when half your forces are trained to avoid fixed positions? There was also the question of supply lines and logistics. Sylvan elves were accustomed to living off whatever the forest provided, hunting game, gathering edible plants, finding shelter in hollow trees or natural caves. But siege warfare requires massive amounts of equipment, food, and medical supplies that have to be transported and distributed according to careful plans. Integrating an army that had never operated with formal supply chains would have created nightmarish logistical problems. The tactical doctrine differences were even more problematic. Woodland warfare prizes individual initiative, quick thinking, and adaptability. Soldiers are expected to make independent decisions based on rapidly changing circumstances. But the White Council's assault on Dol Guldur required precise timing, coordinated movements, and absolute adherence to battle plans. Mixing these two approaches would have created chaos on the battlefield. Consider what happened when the White Council actually attacked Sauron's stronghold. They struck hard, fast, and according to a carefully orchestrated plan that drove the necromancer out of Dol Guldur in a single, coordinated assault. This kind of operation required forces that could execute complex maneuvers without hesitation, that could maintain formation discipline under heavy fire, and that could adapt their tactics to the specific challenges of fortress warfare. Thranduil's army would have tried to fight the way they had always fought, dispersing into the forest, looking for vulnerable targets to strike from ambush, avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. But you cannot take a fortress with guerrilla tactics. You need sustained pressure, concentrated force, and the willingness to take heavy casualties for strategic objectives. The Sylvan Elves' greatest strengths would have become weaknesses in that kind of battle. The Council made the right tactical decision by leaving Thranduil out of their assault. His army was perfectly designed for defending Mirkwood, but completely wrong for attacking Dol Guldur. Including them would have forced the Council to completely redesign their battle plans around accommodating forces that could not contribute meaningfully to the primary objectives. Better to have a smaller, more cohesive strike force than a larger army with contradictory tactical doctrines. Thranduil's identity crisis was deeper than most people realize, and it created exactly the kind of divided loyalty that the White Council could not tolerate in its membership. He was a Sindarin lord ruling over a predominantly Sylvan population, speaking his native Sindarin in a court that functioned primarily in Sylvan traditions, maintaining Sindarin customs in a realm that had developed its own distinct culture over thousands of years. This was not just about language or ceremony, it was about fundamental questions of identity and allegiance that made the other council members doubt where his ultimate loyalties lay. Think of the complexity of his situation. The Sindar were Thingol's people from Doriath, the proud Grey Elves who had never seen the light of Valinor, but had built one of the greatest kingdoms in Beleriand under the protection of Melian's girdle. When Doriath fell and the Sindarin survivors scattered, many had integrated into other communities or sought new homes. But Thranduil's family had taken a different path. They had established themselves as rulers over an entirely different people. The Sylvan Elves were not refugees or immigrants. They were the indigenous population of the Great Forest, people who had lived there since the earliest days of Middle-earth. They had their own customs, their own relationship with the trees and streams, their own ways of organizing society. When Oropher arrived and declared himself their king, he was essentially creating a colonial relationship where Sindarin nobility ruled over Sylvan commoners. This created constant tension that other council members would have recognized as a fundamental weakness. Was Thranduil truly serving the Sylvan Elves' interests, or was he imposing Sindarin values on a people who might prefer their own traditional ways? When crisis came, would he prioritize preserving Sindarin culture or protecting Sylvan lives? The council needed members whose loyalties were absolutely clear, not someone caught between two different people's competing needs. Look at how this played out in practice. Thranduil's court followed Sindarin protocol, but his army was organized according to Sylvan military traditions. His palace architecture reflected Sindarin aesthetic values, but the realm's economy was based on Sylvan woodcraft and hunting skills. He spoke Sindarin with visiting dignitaries, but the common tongue of his kingdom was the Sylvan dialect. These were not merely cultural quirks, they were evidence of a ruler who had never fully resolved his own identity. The other council members did not have this problem. Elrond was thoroughly Noldoran in his leadership style, but he ruled over subjects who had chosen to follow him. Galadriel was explicitly serving as protector of Lothlorien's existing community rather than trying to impose her own cultural values. Círdan's people were fellow Sindarin mariners who shared his heritage and goals. But Thranduil, he was constantly negotiating between his Sindarin instincts and his Sylvan responsibilities. When the council discussed strategies that might require sacrificing smaller realms to protect larger ones, could they trust that he would evaluate those choices objectively? Or would his Sindarin inheritance make him prioritize preserving Elven culture over protecting Sylvan lives? Would his role as protector of the Sylvan people conflict with broader strategic necessities? There was also the deeper question of legitimacy. The other council members ruled by right of achievement, wisdom, or the consent of their subjects. Thranduil ruled by right of conquest. His family had established dominance over the Sylvan elves through superior organization and leadership, but that did not necessarily mean the arrangement would survive serious stress. What if the Sylvan elves decided they would rather have Sylvan leadership during a major crisis? The council could not risk their plans being disrupted by internal conflicts within member realms. They needed leaders whose authority was unquestionable, whose people would follow them into battle without hesitation. Thranduil's complex identity made him a potential liability, not because he was weak or incompetent, but because the fundamental contradictions in his position might explode at exactly the wrong moment. By the time the White Council was actively meeting, Thranduil was showing clear signs of what Tolkien called the fading, that gradual withdrawal from worldly concerns that affects all elves as the ages pass. Unlike his father Orifer, who had died fighting in the Last Alliance, or his contemporary Gil-galad, who had sacrificed everything to defeat Sauron, Thranduil was becoming increasingly isolationist, more focused on preserving what remained than on actively engaging with Middle-earth's larger struggles. The symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Thranduil had stopped expanding his realm's influence, content to maintain the borders he had inherited, rather than seeking new territories or alliances. His court had become more formal and distant, with elaborate ceremonies that served mainly to keep outsiders at arm's length. Most tellingly, he had begun to show that characteristic elven detachment from mortal concerns, viewing the rises and falls of human kingdoms as temporary inconveniences, rather than matters requiring active intervention. This was not a character flaw. It was the natural progression that all elves experienced as they aged, and saw the same conflicts repeat over and over across the centuries. But it made Thranduil fundamentally incompatible with the White Council's mission. The Council needed members who were still fully engaged with Middle-earth's fate, who cared deeply about what happened to men and dwarves and hobbits, who were willing to sacrifice elven interests for the good of all free peoples. Look at the contrast with the other council members. Galadriel was actively involved in nurturing the growing kingdoms of men, maintaining connections with Gondor and Rohan, supporting trade and communication across vast distances. Elrond continued to serve as a refuge for travelers from all races, offering counsel and aid to anyone who needed it. Even Gandalf, who was technically a Maya rather than an elf, showed more commitment to mortal concerns than Thranduil did. The fading process also affected judgment and priorities. Elves who were beginning to fade often became overly cautious, reluctant to take risks that might lead to losses they would have to live with for millennia. They started viewing short-term setbacks as acceptable if they preserved long-term stability. This kind of thinking was exactly wrong for the Council's purposes. They needed members willing to gamble everything on bold strokes rather than playing it safe. Thranduil's increasing withdrawal from outside events meant he was losing touch with the broader currents of Middle-earth's politics and conflicts. His intelligence network was focused mainly on immediate threats to his own realm, rather than the kind of comprehensive surveillance the Council needed. How could someone contribute meaningfully to strategic planning when they were no longer paying close attention to what was happening beyond their own borders? There was also the question of long-term commitment. The Council knew their conflict with Sauron might last for centuries more, requiring sustained effort across multiple generations of men. Could they count on Thranduil to maintain his involvement for that long, or would his fading continue until he became completely indifferent to mortal affairs? Better to build their organization around members who were still burning bright, rather than those whose flame was beginning to dim. The psychological profile was equally concerning. Fading elves often became bitter about losses they had suffered over the centuries, dwelling on past grievances rather than focusing on present opportunities. Thranduil's growing resentment about his father's death, his people's casualties, and the lack of recognition for his realm's sacrifices suggested he was more interested in nursing old wounds than in preventing new ones. Most fundamentally, the fading process represented a gradual disconnection from the very things the White Council was fighting to protect. As elves began their mental preparation for the eventual journey to Valinor, they naturally started caring less about the fate of Middle-earth's mortal inhabitants. The Council needed leaders who were still deeply invested in this world's future, not those who are already beginning their psychological departure. For a king whose realm bordered the greatest intelligence target in Middle-earth, Thranduil's spy network was shockingly inadequate. While Sauron was literally rebuilding his power base just miles from the Woodland Realm's borders, Thranduil spent centuries failing to gather even basic intelligence about what was happening in Dol Guldur. This was not just an oversight. It was a fundamental failure of leadership that revealed exactly why the White Council could not trust him with their most sensitive operations. Consider the timeline. The necromancer first appeared in Dol Guldur around the year 1050 of the Third Age. For nearly 900 years before the White Council's first meeting, Thranduil had the perfect opportunity to gather intelligence on this mysterious enemy. His patrols regularly skirted the edges of Dol Guldur's influence. His hunters and scouts knew every path through the darkened forest. His people were directly affected by whatever dark rituals and military preparations were happening in that ancient stronghold. Yet when Gandalf finally discovered the necromancer's true identity, it came as news to everyone, including Thranduil. How was it possible that someone living next door to Sauron for 9 centuries never figured out who he was dealing with? The White Council members would have asked themselves, if Thranduil cannot identify the most important enemy in Middle-earth when that enemy is practically in his backyard, how can we trust his intelligence about anything else? The failure was not just about Sauron's identity. Thranduil also seems to have missed the steady buildup of military forces in Dol Guldur, the increasing corruption of the forest, the growing coordination between different orc tribes, and the establishment of communication networks that connected Dol Guldur to Mordor. These were exactly the kinds of tactical intelligence that a competent spy network should have detected and reported. Compare this to what the other council members achieved with far less favorable positions. Gandalf, operating as a wandering wizard with no fixed base, managed to penetrate Dol Guldur's defenses and discover crucial information about Sauron's plans. Galadriel, whose realm was much further from the action, still maintained intelligence networks that kept her informed about events across Middle-earth. Even Elrond, focused primarily on preserving ancient lore, had better sources of information about current threats. The intelligence failure also extended to broader strategic awareness. Thranduil seems to have been genuinely surprised by the scope of Sauron's growing power, the coordination between various evil forces, and the timeline of the developing crisis. This suggests his intelligence network was not only bad at penetrating enemy secrets, it was failing to provide basic situational awareness about the most important conflict of the age. Part of the problem was cultural. Sylvan elves were excellent hunters and trackers, but they were not trained in espionage or political intelligence gathering. Their skills were perfect for monitoring wildlife and detecting immediate threats, but completely inadequate for the kind of sophisticated intelligence work needed to understand Sauron's long-term strategies. Thranduil never seems to have recognized this limitation or taken steps to supplement his people's natural abilities with more specialized intelligence techniques. The White Council needed members who could provide reliable, accurate information about enemy activities. Their entire strategy depended on understanding Sauron's capabilities, intentions, and timeline. Including someone whose intelligence network had failed so spectacularly would have been like inviting a blind man to serve as a lookout. They needed sources they could trust, not reports that might be missing the most crucial details. Most damaging of all was what this revealed about Thranduil's strategic thinking. Good intelligence is not just about gathering information. It is about asking the right questions, focusing on the most important targets, and recognizing significant patterns when they emerge. Thranduil's failure suggested he did not understand what kind of information was actually valuable, which meant he could not contribute meaningfully to the Council's analytical processes, even if his intelligence gathering improved. The final and perhaps most decisive factor in Thranduil's exclusion was his psychological inability to function as part of a collaborative leadership team. Everything about his leadership style, from his insistence on absolute monarchy to his refusal to share decision-making authority with anyone, made him fundamentally incompatible with the White Council's consensus-based approach. This was not about ego or personality conflicts. It was about basic management philosophy that could not be reconciled. Look at how the White Council actually functioned when it met. Members would present information, debate strategies, challenge each other's assumptions, and gradually work toward decisions that everyone could support. Sometimes Gandalf would propose a course of action that Elrond would modify, which Galadriel would then refine further, until they developed a plan that incorporated everyone's insights and addressed everyone's concerns. This required intellectual humility, willingness to compromise, and the ability to subordinate personal preferences to group consensus. Thranduil had never operated this way in his entire life. The woodland realm was an absolute monarchy, where the king's word was final. He did not consult advisors, he issued commands. He did not debate policy, he decided it. When external parties wanted to negotiate with his realm, they dealt directly with him, or they dealt with nobody. The idea of sharing authority or accepting group decisions would have been completely foreign to his experience. The psychological profile was clear from his behavior in other contexts. During the events of The Hobbit, when circumstances forced him to work with other leaders, he consistently tried to dominate the situation rather than collaborate. His default response to disagreement was to make threats rather than seek compromise. When things did not go his way, he withdrew entirely rather than continuing to work within the group process. This created practical problems that the council could not ignore. What would happen if they spent weeks developing a careful strategy, only to have Thranduil announce he had decided to do something completely different? How could they maintain operational security if one member might unilaterally reveal their plans to enemy agents? How could they coordinate timing if someone might jump the gun because he decided their schedule was not fast enough? The council also needed members who could handle criticism and debate without taking it personally. Their discussions often involved challenging each other's fundamental assumptions, pointing out flaws in reasoning, and sometimes rejecting proposals that members had spent considerable time developing. Thranduil's track record suggested he would view such challenges as personal attacks, rather than necessary parts of the decision-making process. There was also the question of what would happen when the council had to make decisions that negatively affected the woodland realm. Good collaborative leadership sometimes requires accepting short-term costs to your own interests for long-term benefits to the group. Could Thranduil vote to support strategies that might leave his people more vulnerable? Or would he consistently prioritize his realm's immediate needs over broader strategic objectives? The communication style differences were equally problematic. Council members needed to be able to express disagreement respectfully, accept feedback gracefully, and continue working together even after heated debates. Thranduil's tendency toward dramatic pronouncements, ultimatums, and wounded silences would have poisoned the group dynamic that made collaborative decision-making possible. Most fundamentally, the White Council required members who understood that their individual wisdom was enhanced by working together, not diminished by it. Each member brought unique knowledge and perspectives that made the group collectively smarter than any individual could be alone. Thranduil's autocratic mindset suggested he viewed collaboration as weakness rather than strength, which made him unsuitable for an organization whose entire power came from successfully combining different forms of expertise and authority. So there you have it, 10 interconnected reasons why Thranduil, despite commanding the largest elven army in Middle-earth, was deliberately excluded from the most important strategic council of the Third Age. It was not because the other members did not respect his power or underestimated his capabilities. It was because they understood that military strength alone was not enough to defeat Sauron. They needed perfect coordination, absolute trust, flawless intelligence, and the ability to make sacrificial decisions for the greater good. Thranduil's exclusion reveals something profound about leadership during existential crises. Sometimes, the most qualified person on paper is exactly the wrong choice for the mission at hand. The White Council succeeded not despite leaving out the woodland realm, but because they had the wisdom to recognize that adding even a powerful ally with fundamental incompatibilities would have weakened their effectiveness. What do you think? Did the White Council make the right choice, or did their prejudices against Thranduil cost them valuable resources they could not afford to waste? Have you noticed other examples in Tolkien's work where political considerations trumped military logic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing different perspectives on these deep lore questions. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden politics of Middle-earth, Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have dozens more videos exploring the untold stories, hidden connections, and secret motivations that make Tolkien's world so endlessly fascinating. Next week, we are diving into why Saruman's betrayal was actually inevitable from the moment he first studied the enemy's methods. Trust me, once you see the evidence, you will never view the White Wizard the same way again. Until then, may the light of the Eldar guide your steps, and may the shadows of ancient grudges never cloud your vision.